Hello everyone, thanks for joining me for a deep dive into the Lian O11 Dynamic Mini, which I thought was the Snow Edition when I ordered it, but apparently not. Difference between the Snow and this Standard Edition is it's just white bezels instead of black around the edges of the glass. That's it really. But anyway, before we kick off on the review, this video is sponsored by Skillshare, and the first 1,000 people to click the link in the video description will get 7 days premium access. More about them later, but let's get started with that review. As always, the first place to start a review is with the unboxing, but it's about as dull as dishwater and about the same colour, so we'll be brief. Of course, the star of the show is the O11 Dynamic Mini itself, but I found a loose screw in the box which was trying to steal the spotlight. More on that later. Onto the exterior overview. Visually, this case is just a miniature version of the O11 Dynamic itself, and it's a good look. We've got a very iconic brushed aluminium or aluminum front plate, and it's got some thickness to it, which is a trend throughout the case. Personally, I like the added texture since it catches light differently to the adjoining panels. It also catches skin, which it could do a little bit of deburring on the top side, not so bad on the bottom side. When I reviewed the Neo Cube, which is the copycat to this case's bigger brother, I found out this brushed metal front plate was quite divisive, so I'll throw this one out to you guys. Would you prefer this case with or without the brushed aluminium front plate? Of course, to the front and side we've got glass all over with a slight tint, and opposing the main glass panel is a steel side panel. It serves as the main intake for the majority of the system components, but that's a little concerning since it's mostly metal and filtered. We'll have to see how it performs later. Like the brushed front plate, this too has ridiculous girth to it, being just shy of 3mm all over, which is nice and solid, but as far as I can tell, completely overkill. Holding at the rear is frankly the messiest back end I have seen to date. It actually reminds me of Curry Night? There are thumb screws everywhere, and that's all due to the flexibility of this case, which is ironic considering the thickness of the steel. Not really, but we'll cover that in the motherboard section. In its standard 7 PCI Express slot configuration, you've got your SFX power supply unit position to the top left, 3.5-inch drive cage access to the bottom left, PCI Express covers to the bottom right, and a top right 120mm fan position with a top center motherboard position. Down below we've got a large filter for a bottom intake for fans or radiators. It slots through the feet with a less than smooth action, although that wasn't so bad. I think it wears in quite well. It also has none of that has it slotted in yet kind of issue, since it's very accurate when it goes back in. Good enough for your odd filter clean once in a while. Back to the feet though, these pads are massive, and it's no surprise since the more you look at this case, the more it seems to cater for some heavy water cooling builds, so the large rubber pads aren't a bad idea. And rounding off the exterior is the top panel, and yes, it actually is a panel. But before that, right next to it is the front I/O, consisting of a power button, 3.5mm mic and headphone combo jack, USB 3.1 Type-C, and a couple of 3.0 Type-A ports. We're missing a reset button here, but I've only ever heard of one person that's expressed that that was a deal breaker for them, so this should be more than enough for most people, especially those fast ports. So that's the exterior out of the way, let's get inside. To get inside the main compartment, the top panel needs removing first before anything else can. To the rear are a couple of captive thumb screws, which like any captive thumb screws are kind of a pain in the ass to work with initially and get progressively worse as the thread in the panel being removed gets chewed up because you can't see where it is, and it's a nightmare. They just get worse every time. You just can't tell when it's there. With that panel out of the way, we find another filter, this one missing a notch out of the front to accommodate the plastic posts on the top plate that secure it to the top of the chassis. Now this is a bit of a head scratcher to me, since I thought, why not secure the filter to the top panel and make it a single thing to remove, which I think is fair since Lian is all about going above and beyond to make the user experience ever so slightly better. But here's the thing. The external panels, top and side, they're not magnetic, which is kind of confusing since they're heavy like steel. So we're either dealing with austenitic steel, thanks Google, or they're aluminium and I'm just an idiot for not being well versed in the weight of this much aluminium. Or aluminum. Anyway, magnets don't stick to them, but they do to the main chassis, which seems to be some sort of standard steel. So with the top panel removed, the side and front panel can also be removed. The side panel utilizing a scattering of the rounded posts seen on the top, but also these lower flat profile fingers that sit into the feet, which do a nice job of lining it up, and the front panel just goes for the rounded posts, same as the top and side panels, which seems to do the trick nicely. Moving on to the steel side panel, probably steel anyway, that has another couple of captive thumb screws and it slides to the rear to be removed. I'm not sure if it needs saying, but once those thumb screws are removed, the panel is pretty much unsecure and you should support it. Most other cases have some sort of linear hook at the front which you can kind of rely on to hold the panel without screws, but not in this case. Before I move on from panel removal, the front aluminium panel looks like it's removable since you can spot a couple of hooks on the inside, and as punishment for being a lazy scrub, I have to see if it can be removed now. These screws, I believe they're removing the top I/O. You might be asking why I'm removing the I/O. Well, I think there's some link to it in the top plate. When you need to remove the top plate to get rid of the aluminium panel, or at least that's what it seems. I think I have to remove the power supply unit to do this. If I break this, I'll be very annoyed. Ooh. The answer is yes, but you will need to remove a rivet from the top to enable the panel to be slotted up. And that's the answer to that. There's also these plastic bits, which they don't break off, they're just kind of friction fitted to the top panel to sandwich it together, kind of. So yeah, can be done, will need a drill. Then I guess you could replace that front panel if you so chose to. Honestly, one thing I'll say is that is kind of disappointing that you unravel all of this and you can't remove that front plate. I mean, I know the chances of you being able to separate the aluminium from the frame that they've attached it to is very low, so it's not like it's a user replaceable part, but it's kind of disappointing that it seems unbuildable and then it isn't at the last point. So if that could have been a screw, that would have been great, but I see why it's not. I'd also be tempted to say if it's not a user replaceable part, then it should probably be riveted in from the start so it doesn't give the wrong impression. I guess from a serviceability standpoint though, it's nice to be able to take the panel off with screws. I mean, if anything's going to fail in this, it'll be something on this part, not the front. It's just aluminium. Oh, nothing else is happening now. I'm just putting it back together, just trying to stretch it to the 10-minute mark. Make sure we're there. Could be a 20-minute mark or half an hour mark next time, so I want to make sure I'm there. Never going to make it 5 minutes, so, reach for the stars. Time! So that's panel removal dealt with, let's build something inside this thing. We've sort of touched on the radiator, fan and filter situation of this case already, but since it's one of the most important parts of a case, let's finish that off first before moving on. So up front, sort of, we've got a filtered intake that can hold up to a 280 or 360mm radiator with fans, or just a couple of 140 or a few 120mm fans. To the base we've got another filtered intake with the same support as the front, and up top we've got another filtered panel. Typically this would be used as an exhaust, the filter here to prevent settling dust, but we'll have to play around and see what works with it later. Again, the same support as the front and base. And holding up the rear is your very standard unfiltered 120mm exhaust. A bit of advice I give to anyone looking to do a tight or complex water cooling build and want to squeeze the largest radiators possible into the thing, I mean, we've all been there, is to buy the case that is as close to as what you think you want as possible, such as this one. If you want maximum radiator compatibility, this seems like the one. Get that first, then build your system in an air-cooled configuration, and then take all the measurements from that. You'll be able to get so much more accurate information from that than anything else I can give you, especially with such a complex case like this. Just a variation in your motherboard, VRM, a heatsink might make a big difference to you if you're really pushing that far, so just, it's worth doing it. Best advice I can give you. It's also worth noting, back of the manual, plenty of great clearance information there for you. Also scratched my arm making this video for you guys, so hit the like and subscribe button and all of that will go away. This being a Lian case, they're never an easy review, but at least that's a benefit to the buyer. A feature this case has that most don't is the ability to tailor the position of your motherboard to suit your setup. So in its default position, this is an ATX case with a 7 PCI Express slot layout to the bottom. You could also choose to put a micro ATX or ITX motherboard in with this setup, or rip out most of the back end, move the motherboard section down and put one of the blank panels from the accessories box up top. This is the 5-slot configuration and gives you more room up top for radiator support. Granted, that's at the cost of ATX motherboard support, but with a micro ATX board, you could go for a big front and top based water cooling build with a couple of graphics cards, or just stick to one graphics card and have radiators all over. But maybe if you've got something like that in mind, you might want to take it a step further, or in my opinion, a step too far. If we go to the back once more, rip most of it out and move the motherboard slot down again, you've got an abundance of room up top for a thick exhaust radiator. Now this configuration only officially supports an ITX motherboard, which I didn't know at the time of catching this footage, so when I eyed up the micro ATX board, I took it for granted it could work, but that's not good enough for you guys. I was going to say after publishing the review, I'd check out during the dismantling process if this could have worked, but instead I went back just after testing the various testing things just to check if it could have worked, and it totally could have worked. If it wasn't for this fold, you could have put a micro ATX board into this case in the 3-slot configuration. Or if they'd made this case 2mm taller, and I kid you not, it's just 2mm taller, you totally could have put a micro ATX board in with the 3-slot configuration. Make it 3mm for tolerance, but that seems to me like a missed opportunity to allow micro ATX board to make the most of the 3 slots rather than limiting it to an ITX board configuration with a 2.5 or 3-slot graphics card, something along those lines. I mean, there's good ventilation down there, so you can really squeeze a graphics card right up against the base, and I think it would be completely fine. So yeah, 2mm taller, I'd like to see that, just to make it that extra bit functional, like genuinely a fair amount functional for 2mm. Regarding actually installing a motherboard in the case, for any motherboard that's larger than an ITX board, you get this extension panel to install. It partially covers the cable management grommets, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, and it's surprisingly completely solid when secured. I mean, not that surprising since it's Lian case, but they are pretty careful with these things. The whole variable motherboard placement situation can seem a little complicated at first, but once you've chosen your desired configuration, be it 5, 3, or 7 slots, that was a weird order to put it in, 3, 5, or 7 slots, you need to make sure you've got the standoffs in the correct marked positions, and then you're good to go. Power connections to the board are nice and simple since there's no grill to the radiator or fan positions, so you can cram your hands in from any direction. But that doesn't mean you can't be careful. Accidents can happen all the time, even under ideal conditions. One of the size reducing techniques Lian adopted in the design of this case was using the SFX or SFXL power supply unit form factor. To get an idea of the size reducing impact of an SFX power supply unit, I've thrown an SFX sized Corsair SF600 together with an ATX sized Silverstone Strider Gold Series power supply unit. Bear in mind this ATX power supply unit is one of the smallest ATX units on the market at only 140mm long, but that doesn't affect the height, which is what matters here since that's the optimal mounting position for this case, and the difference between SFX and ATX power supply units is about 22mm in terms of its height, or about 7/8 of an inch. Now this really doesn't bother me that much since the positioning of the power supply unit is optimal to account for the shorter length of SFX power supply unit cables, although the graphics card power cables were tight. But I want to throw this one out to you guys. Would you prefer to save the 22mm and be limited to, on the whole, more expensive SFX power supply unit, or would you prefer a 22mm wider case and be limited to very short 140mm or less ATX power supply units with the option to adapt down to an SFX power supply unit? I can see why Lian took this approach, and I think SFX was the right call. Either way, you're limited, but it would be interesting to see what the general consensus of the design is by you guys. That's enough about the power supply unit, let's talk drives. We'll start with the 3.5-inch drive cage, which is over-engineered to the nth degree. It's got its own hatch to the rear for, well, Honestly, I think it's just because it was the only elegant way of accessing both of the sleds with them mounted in this orientation. The cage itself is steel, as are the sleds, and they can take 3.5-inch or 2.5-inch drives if you need them to. Now, this is where the mystery of the loose screw comes to a close, and after more time than it probably should have taken, I figured out it was for the small plate that secures these sleds in the cage. With the plate in the correct position and the thumb screw securing it in, this is a more fancy way of stopping the sleds from sliding out. Hopefully this loose screw situation is a one-off, otherwise I'd prefer to see some plastic sleds. They're just as simple and you're not exactly using these sleds much, but I get it, it's a premium case. Just before I get onto the 2.5-inch drives, it's worth highlighting that there's a good chunk of space below the drive cage that's just there, and well, there's not a lot I could think of using that space for. It's way too far from the power supply in it to store excess cables, but maybe you could throw a fan or RGB controller down there, as long as it's not deeper than 70mm, which my NZXT grid just is. If we're being picky, and this is a $130 case, so I'm gonna get extra picky, I think the drive cage could have been mounted more efficiently, and that space could have been shifted to the top, where it would have been, on the whole, a lot more usable. Right, 2.5-inch drives. In the rear compartment, there's a panel with an extra fancy Lian/Der Bauer plate. That's very well and all for the limited time you'll be in here, but what does the panel actually do? Well, simply put, it holds 2.5-inch drives, 2 of them officially, and it does a decent job. But when you can game a system, you game a system, right? Thanks to the grommet and screw mounting assembly that slots into the holes of the panel, you can mount 2 drives properly, or 4 drives jankily. I think I'm going a little bit crazy doing this. If you fix 2 grommets to 4 drives in the right way, you can get half-decent support to the drives and squeeze 4 of them onto the panel, 2 to each side. This does pose a lot of issues, which is to be expected when using a product outside of its intended use, such as cable management, absolute nightmare, and potentially scratching the back of the drives with the heads of the opposing drive screw, which could be prevented with some tape. But in messing around with this panel, I also figured out I don't like the support for just 2 drives on the outside of the panel, not even the 4 drive situation. It is 2 drives to the outside is officially supported. The holes earmarked for the power and data cables to travel through are just too small for probably half the SATA power and data connectors around, which causes some really tight cable bends. I mean, there's more emphasis on the bloody logo than there is for the support of externally mounted 2.5-inch drives to this panel, which, if we're touting this as a well-designed case because Der Bauer was involved, I mean, his name in this is literally making this a worse product. Tighten that down, give more space for connectors. So, I say go with 2 internally mounted drives, or budget for, say, a power supply unit that has specific low-profile connectors for hard disk drives, some extra, say, connector drives or adapters to get some lower profile connectors for your drives here, which will support the external drives, or the 4-drive bonanza. Definitely something wrong. So what's the graphics card installation situation like? Very easy actually, at least slotting the card into the motherboard and securing it in place. Nice chunky back plate to the panel as well. Anyway, like I mentioned in the power supply unit section, SFX power supply units are typically a little skimpy in the length department since they're intended for smaller cases which are short of room, so less cable length is typically a good thing. In this case, the cable length issue is alleviated by the high position of the power supply unit closer to the motherboard connection, but cable length is still tight, and I happen to be using the same power supply unit as shown in the manual, so tight is as it's advertised to be, I guess. You could buy an SFX power supply unit with slightly longer cables than the SF600s, or go with some custom cables which would be pricey, but required if you wanted to position the graphics card any lower in the system, such as the 5-slot configuration. You might be able to stretch a 5-slot with the SF600 standard ones, but especially a 3-slot configuration, or if you're going for dual graphics cards, you'd have to get some sort of extender. I mean, extension cables, actually, by that point, they are much cheaper than full custom cables, which could be an option for you. And last but not least, we'll finish off with the parts box, which you've seen in action throughout the video already. Not the box itself, but the stuff inside. So, for your standard 3 and 5 slot configurations, you get a couple of these blank plates. Now, I have a feeling this is an isolated incident, but I had some paint quality issues on mine. You also get some plates to mount pumps to the front of the case, and even one you can use to mount a pump off your radiator, which doesn't directly contact the case, so they're clearly going above and beyond to support water cooling here. Onto the test results. Now, here at AV Techie, I personally pride myself with needlessly overwhelming as many viewers as possible with overcomplicated graphs. Alright, that's not exactly true. Sometimes I screw up and make my graphs too hard to look at, so I hope you enjoy these long overdue renovated ones, at least most of them. Without covering all the details of all the testing nuances, that gets boring quick. In the stock full fan speed test, pretty self-explanatory, the O11 Dynamic choked hard on priority 5 with the CPU hitting 100 degrees, which on average crashed the system 69% through the 10-minute run. Only a touch better than the open air test bench with much smaller CPU coolers, which failed even harder, hence the screwy bars at the bottom, the bad overlapping. This makes the graphics card look like it's running cool in this stock O11D Mini, but the reality is the system crashed. That was as hot as it got, so that was an outright fail for the O11 Dynamic Mini. The darker sets of bars, that's the Firestrike testing by the way, which at least was a load that didn't crash the system, but still quite toasty. But stock, it's a case with no fans, and the understanding appears to be you might add some of your own fans, probably advisable. So we'll touch on that in a second, but it's worth pointing out the Thermaltake Core P3 is my open air test bench, so if you're looking to see how the test system performs outside the case, the Core P3 with the Scythe Mugen 5 is the exact same system, with the exact same settings, cooler fan speeds, and all. I also grabbed the TD500 mesh to have something reasonably airy, not too much larger, and relatively closely priced-ish to compare to, but since it comes with 3 fans, it's clearly performing a lot better in this test, albeit a fair chunk louder. So what about testing with some case fans? Well, this is where things get complex. I decided to add 3 of my test fans in 3 different configurations, 3 being the max I will add to any given build. First was 2 front intakes through a pretty dense grille and 1 rear exhaust. Second was 2 base intakes through the more open chassis base and 1 rear exhaust. And the third setup was 1 top intake, 1 base intake, and 1 rear exhaust. I made sure to run the intakes through filters, since unfiltering an intake is just avoiding the point of filters, hence why there's no configurations with a rear intake. So it turns out that there really wasn't much difference in performance of the case regarding fan position. All setups were noise normalized, so even though the 1 top 1 base intake was able to run the fans a touch faster, it's not like it knocked us a substantial amount of heat from any of the components. The bottom line is, with 3 extra fans, the O11 Dynamic Mini is a couple of degrees hotter than the TD500 mesh that comes with 3 fans and was given 1 extra fan for a rear exhaust. But bear in mind, this testing is noise normalized, so all of these systems are outputting the same noise level regardless of case fan totals, apart from the Core P3 test bench with no case fans, which is 1 decibel quieter as it's just a control. But if we change over to sorting these figures by GPU temperature, the O11 Dynamic Mini is performing nearly 3 degrees Celsius cooler than the TD500 mesh, which is a pretty solid performance. Concluding this review, and I know this is going to be a little painful to look at, we need to think about the price of the O11 Dynamic Mini. What you're seeing now is a bar chart of the prices of the various setups with and without additional fans. Each fan priced at about £15 each, or your regional equivalent. We're also going to be basing the conclusion off the optimal testing, since it's the most realistic and noise normalized. So if you go for the O11 Dynamic Mini, you're going to throw in some fans, preferably 3 of them, and that'll cost you around £145, €158 or $165, which is a lot more than the stock TD500 mesh that comes with 3 fans costing about 40% less. Oh yeah, and this mental figure of €250 is as cheap as the Core P3 open air test bench gets in Germany, but it's about $150 or £130 elsewhere. If we take these figures and combine them with the performance from the optimal testing, we get some interesting results. results. So for America and the United States of, it's no surprise that if you spend 40% less and the performance is similar, you get much better value. Lower numbers are better, by the way. So the TD500 mesh is the best value on the board, ignoring the corner of fail to the bottom. I'll rip those out for next time. But if you spend more on the Core P3, which is about 30% more expensive than the O11 Dynamic Mini without any more fans, and if you add no fans to it, it performs better than the O11 Dynamic Mini and costs less, since you're having to add fans to the O11 Dynamic Mini to make it work. And to be even more fair to the Core P3, it's actually running 1 decibel quieter in the testing, since it's the controlled set of results. So yeah, spending more on a very high airflow case gets you better value. Yeah, open air isn't for, well, nearly everybody, so let's move on to the UK. There's not much difference in the UK, to be honest, so go with what I said about it for the US, and in the EU, specifically Germany, the cost of the Core P3 is so high it's not worth considering on any level, so if you're just looking for good value, go for the TD500 mesh or similar. But I don't think that's a completely fair conclusion. Sure, you can look at the raw numbers, but that loses all the unknown potential. What I mean is, there are so many options to this case that there's no way for them to show up in those numbers. What I can tell you from testing is the O11 Dynamic Mini isn't a bad performer regarding air resistance or air flow, depending on your worldview. Combining that with the understanding that this case is primed for water cooling, and you can rest easy knowing that any of your water cooling efforts that this case supports in abundance aren't compensating for a really air-resistive case, airflow-resistive case. They're just adding to the performance on the table. It's all very well and good water cooling your build to push it to the max, but if you're leaving performance on the table in other areas, well, you're only as strong as your weakest link. To ensure that weakest link isn't you should consider checking out Skillshare. Last time Skillshare sponsored a video, I had binged my way through the video on a budget course by Christopher Rhodes and the Productivity for Creatives class by Thomas Frank. But then I saw the YouTube Success class by MKBHD, and you can't not watch that when it's offered to you on a plate. If anything, it's a cool behind the scenes on how they work, but it's the kind of course that helps to solidify the basics and helps to give you some assurance in what works, which spoke directly to me trying to run a tech channel. I still need to watch the DIY backdrops class by Tabitha Park, but this review has completely chewed up all of my spare time. Anyway, along with the created aspect to Skillshare, I think one of the least understood benefits to Skillshare is the lack of ads stepping in the way, which stops your mind being saturated by unhelpful information when you're opening your mind up to discovering and learning new skills, unless you really want that skill to be knowing what the latest gambling games are. So if any of that takes your fancy, it's less than $10 per month with an annual subscription, and the first 1,000 of you to click the link in the video description will get a free trial of premium membership, so you can check out the MKBHD course for free and then some while supporting this channel in the process. So that should be plenty on the table for you to make your own mind up about this case. Thanks for joining me on this one, and if you do like the O11 Dynamic Mini and are thinking about picking one up, please consider using my Amazon associate links in the video description. It helps me out at no expense to you, and I'd really appreciate it. If you want to see more like this, hit the subscribe and bell buttons, and consider a like and a comment to let me know what you thought of this one and what you want to see in the future. A special thanks to my patrons. It was actually Kokota that unknowingly inspired me to test more fan setups in the O11 Dynamic Mini, which turned out to yield mixed results, not much difference, but we now know. And it was Toto that requested another case to compare to, so we had more to go on. This is a new test methodology after all, so it's a little limited in its coverage at the moment. And of course, thanks to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. Remember to get your free trial of premium membership in the video description to get some knowledge and also help me out. Thanks for all the additional support, guys. Oh, and I'll catch you in the next one. Oh no, don't damage the case.